Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn and watched the stars through the main viewport. But his mind was not on their beauty. It was on the battle reports that kept streaming in from every corner of Council space, each one worse than the last, each one telling the same story of death and defeat that had been playing out for 2 centuries now. And he was tired of it. So very tired of watching good people die for a war that seemed to have no end in sight. The Galactic Council had been fighting the Krathi swarm for longer than most species cared to remember, and what had started as a simple territorial dispute had grown into something far worse, a war of extinction where the insectoid Krathi bred faster than anyone could kill them, swarming across planets like locusts and leaving nothing but bare rock behind. And the Council species had thrown everything they had at the problem. The proud Vexari with their particle weapons, the ancient Tileran with their shield technology, the brilliant Zenthir with their tactical computers, and dozens of other races who had joined together in desperation. But none of it seemed to matter because the Krathi just kept coming. Humanity had joined this mess 15 years ago, when their first faster-than-light ships had ventured beyond Sol system and found a galaxy at war, and being human they had immediately volunteered to help, because that was what humans did. They saw people in trouble and rushed in to save them without thinking about the cost. And now here they were, bleeding ships and personnel at a rate that made Jake sick to think about. Losing colonies they had barely finished building, watching their allies die by the millions, while the Krathi numbers never seemed to decrease no matter how many battles they won. Lieutenant Amy. Chen turned from her console with another message clutched in her hand, and Jake already knew what it would say before she spoke, because they all said the same thing these days. Calls for help that came too late, distress signals from ships that were already dead by the time anyone could respond, requests for reinforcements that nobody had to send. And he was right because Amy's voice was tight with controlled emotion as she read the latest disaster. The Taloran Third Fleet had been ambushed near the Tertius system and was taking heavy casualties. They needed immediate support, or they would be completely destroyed within the hour. And Jake knew he should order his ship to jump there right away because that was what the Council expected. That was what his orders said. But he also knew that by the time they arrived, the Teleron fleet would probably be gone, and his own ship would just be throwing itself into the same meat grinder. And he was so tired of feeding the meat grinder. He gave the order anyway because what else could he do? And the Valiant Dawn jumped into hyperspace while Jake pulled up the casualty reports from the last month and felt his stomach turn. 30,000 human personnel lost, 12 ships destroyed, 5 colonies evacuated, and that was just humanity's losses. The other Council species had it far worse because at least humans had good weapons and better tactics. The Taloran were losing 3 ships for every Krathi vessel they managed to destroy. And that math simply did not work out in the long run. You could not win a war when you were bleeding that badly. What Jake did not know was that back on Earth some very important people were having a very different kind of conversation. The kind that would change everything. And Admiral Helen Brooks sat across from President Kevin Walsh in a bunker deep underground, where they could speak freely without worrying about who might be listening. And the numbers she showed him were even worse than what Jake had seen, because she had the full picture. The complete accounting of what this war was costing humanity, and it was not sustainable. Helen slid the data pad across the table and watched Kevin's face go pale as he read through the projections. And she did not need to explain what they meant because the numbers spoke for themselves. At current casualty rates, humanity would be combat ineffective within 8 years, unable to field enough ships or train enough personnel to make a difference. And the other Council species were already past that point. They were running on fumes and desperation, and the blind hope that somehow things would turn around. But Helen had been a military officer for 40 years, and she knew what hope was worth in war. Absolutely nothing unless you had a plan to back it up. Kevin looked up from the reports, and his voice was quiet when he spoke, asking what she recommended, and Helen did not hesitate because she had been thinking about this for months now, running the scenarios, checking the numbers, and always coming to the same conclusion. Humanity needed to withdraw from Council space entirely, seal their borders, pull back every ship and soldier and colony, and let the Council finish their war without human blood being spilled for a cause that was already lost. The president sat back in his chair and Helen could see him, aging before her eyes as he processed what she was saying. And she knew it was not an easy thing to hear because humans did not abandon their allies, that went against everything they believed in. But she also knew that staying would mean the extinction of humanity along with everyone else. And she would not let that happen. She would not sacrifice her species on the altar of someone else's pride. Kevin asked the question she had been expecting. What about the council species who depended on human support? What about the colonies where humans and aliens lived side by side? What about the promises Earth had made when they joined the council 15 years ago? And Helen had answers for all of it, but they were hard answers. Cold answers, the kind that kept her awake at night. But she gave them anyway because someone had to be willing to say the difficult truths. They would offer asylum to any council citizens who wanted to come to human space. They would evacuate the mixed colonies. They would honor their agreements by giving proper notice of withdrawal, but they would not stay and die for a war that could not be won the way it was being fought. And maybe, just maybe, if humanity pulled back and had time to think and plan and innovate without the constant pressure of battle, they could find a different way to fight. A better way, but that would require time and safety and resources that they did not have while throwing themselves at the Krathi over and over. Again, Kevin was silent for a long time, and Helen let him think, because this was not a decision to be made lightly. This was the kind of choice that would define humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. Either they would be remembered as the cowards who ran, or they would be remembered as the wise ones who knew when to step back and regroup. And right now it was impossible to say which it would be. Finally, Kevin nodded and told her to prepare the withdrawal plans, and Helen felt relief and dread in equal measure, because she knew this was the right choice, but she also knew what it would cost in terms of reputation and relationships. The council would hate them for this, would curse the human name and write them out of history as traitors, but at least there would be humans alive to hear those curses, and that was worth any amount of hatred. She left the bunker and began making calls, setting in motion a plan that would pull every human asset back behind Earth's borders within 90 days. And out in space, Jake Morrison was still fighting the same losing battles, still following orders to jump from one disaster to another, still watching good people die, and he had no idea that everything was about to change. 3 months had passed since that meeting in the bunker, and Jake Morrison found himself standing in a conference room on Earth instead of on his ship where he belonged, surrounded by every flag officer in the human military, and a crowd of politicians who all looked like they had not slept in weeks, and he had no idea why he had been recalled from active duty until President. Kevin Walsh stepped up to the podium and the room went completely silent in a way that made Jake's skin prickle with anticipation. The president's words hit like a physical blow, and Jake felt the floor drop out from under him as Kevin calmly explained that Earth was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately, that all human forces were to return to Sol system within 90 days, that the war they had been fighting for 15 years was over as far as humanity was concerned, and Jake could not believe what he was hearing because humans did not quit. They did not abandon people who needed them. They did not run away from a fight no matter how bad it got. The room erupted into chaos with officers shouting questions and demanding explanations, and Jake found himself on his feet without remembering standing up, his voice joining the chorus of disbelief and anger. But Admiral Helen Brooks raised her hand, and somehow that simple gesture cut through the noise like a blade. And when she spoke, her voice was hard as steel and twice as cold, telling them all that she knew this was difficult, but it was also necessary because the Council had been fighting this war the same way for 200 years, and losing, throwing bodies at an enemy that bred faster than they could kill, and humanity was not going to die that way. Jake wanted to argue, but Helen's eyes found his across the room, and she asked him directly how many more people he wanted to watch die, how many more ships he wanted to lose, how many more battles he wanted to fight, knowing that victory meant nothing because tomorrow there would be another battle, and another, and another, until there was nobody left to fight, and he had no answer for that because she was right. The war was unwinnable the way they were fighting it, but walking away felt wrong in a way he could not put into words. Helen seemed to read his thoughts because she continued talking, explaining that they were not abandoning the fight itself but changing how they fought it, that humanity needed time to think and plan and innovate without the constant pressure of battle, that they were going to find a different way to beat the Krathi, but first they had to survive long enough to find it. And Jake wanted to believe her, but it still felt like surrender no matter how she dressed it up. The Admiral gave him his orders personally after the briefing, telling him to lead the withdrawal of the Fourth Fleet and bring every human ship and person home safely. And Jake took the orders because he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders even when they hated them. But inside he felt like he was betraying every alien who had fought beside him, every Taloran pilot who had saved his life, every Vexari commander who had trusted human support, and the weight of that betrayal sat in his chest like a stone. The news spread through council space faster than light, and the reaction was exactly what Jake had feared. The Galactic Council called an emergency session and condemned Earth as traitors and cowards. Ambassador Vextar of the Vexari personally contacted President Walsh, and his holographic form shook with rage as he called humans every name Jake had ever heard and several he had not. And Kevin just stood there and took it with a calm that Jake found infuriating, because how could he be so calm when the entire galaxy was cursing their name? Vextar demanded to know how humanity could abandon them in their darkest hour, how they could run away and hide while civilizations fell and entire species died. And Kevin's response was simple and devastating, saying that they were not abandoning anyone. They were refusing to participate in collective suicide, that the Council was welcome to try humanity's way, but first they had to want to change. And the ambassador cut the connection with a curse that probably violated a dozen diplomatic protocols. Jake spent the next 3 months jumping from system to system and gathering up human forces. And it was the hardest thing he had ever done, because every ship he collected meant leaving someone behind. Every colony he evacuated meant watching aliens who had trusted humanity stare at them with betrayal in their eyes. And every time he gave the order to jump away, he felt a little piece of himself die. But he kept doing it because those were his orders, and because deep down he knew Helen was right, even if he hated admitting it. The last ship to leave Council space was the Valiant Dawn, because Jake refused to go until every other human was safely away. And as his ship crossed back into Sol system, he looked at the sensor readings showing the war they were leaving behind. The battle's still raging, the distress call still screaming across the void, and he wondered if they would ever forgive humanity for this, if history would remember them as cowards, or if someday they would understand why this had to be done. Earth's borders sealed shut like a closing fist, and not a single human ship crossed back into Council space. Not one message was answered. Not one call for help was acknowledged, and the Galactic Council responded exactly as expected. They condemned humanity in every language and dialect known to the galaxy. They erased human names from their honor rolls. They wrote songs about the great betrayal and told stories of human cowardice to their children. And Jake heard every word of it, because cutting off communication did not mean he stopped listening. The Taloran lost their homeworld 6 months after humanity withdrew, and Jake watched the reports come in, showing millions of dead, billions displaced, an entire civilization scattered to the winds. And he wanted to scream, because maybe if humans had stayed, that would not have happened. Maybe their ships could have made the difference. But Admiral Brooks showed him the projections and made him see that staying would have just meant humans dying alongside the Taloran, not saving them. And that knowledge was cold comfort when he watched the footage of Taloran cities burning. The Zenthir were next, their fleets reduced to 15% strength and falling back to their core systems. And the Vexari began preparing for a last stand at their capital, because they had nowhere else to go. And every report that came in made Jake hate himself a little more for following orders, for bringing his people home, for choosing human survival over alien lives. But he kept his mouth shut and did his duty, because what else could he do? President Walsh appeared on every human news channel and explained why they had withdrawn, laying out the numbers and the projections, showing people exactly what staying would have cost, and most humans understood. Most accepted that sometimes you had to make hard choices, but there were protests too. People who said humanity should have stayed and fought to the last. People who called their leaders cowards and traitors. And Jake understood those people, because he felt the same way, even though he knew they were wrong. What none of them knew, what Jake and most of humanity did not know, was what was happening in the secret research stations scattered through human space. The projects that Admiral Brooks had started before the withdrawal was even announced. The work that Dr. Lisa Grant and thousands of other scientists were doing 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, racing against time to find the answer that would change everything. Helen Brooks had not withdrawn humanity from the war because she wanted to give up. She had withdrawn them because she needed time to win it properly. And while the galaxy cursed the human name and the Council died slowly in the void, Humanity was building something that would change the rules of warfare forever, but nobody outside Earth's borders knew that yet, and that was exactly how Helen wanted it. 5 years had passed since humanity sealed its borders, and in that time, not a single human ship had crossed back into Council space, not one message had been answered, not one call for help acknowledged, and the galaxy had learned to hate the human name with a passion that burned hotter than any star. But inside human space, something extraordinary was taking shape, something that would change everything, and Dr. Lisa Grant stood at the observation window of Titan Research Station, watching it happen with her own eyes. The construction drones moved with mechanical precision as they assembled the prototype, working day and night to build something that should not be possible according to every physics textbook ever written. But somehow it was real, a massive sphere nearly a kilometer across that bristled with technology so advanced it made Lisa's head hurt, just thinking about how it worked. And she had helped design the thing, so she understood it better than almost anyone alive. Peter Hughes called out from his workstation that the quantum calculations were holding
stable, and Lisa felt her heart leap because
they had been chasing stable quantum states for 3 years now, burning through funding and equipment and the patience of their military overseers. But finally, they had done it. They had broken the laws of physics just enough to make the impossible real. And she allowed herself a small smile because this was going to change the war. This was going to change everything, General. Frank Cooper stood behind them watching the construction, with the critical eye of a man who had spent 40 years in the military and had seen every miracle weapon fail in spectacular ways. And he asked the question that Lisa had been expecting since the beginning, asking her to explain in simple terms what exactly they had built and why it would work when everything else had failed. And she took a deep breath before launching into an explanation that she had practiced 1,000 times, but still struggled to make simple enough for non-scientists to understand. The Krathi swarm was winning the war through simple mathematics. They bred faster than anyone could kill them. They moved faster than traditional fleets could respond. They overwhelmed through sheer numbers, and conventional warfare could not stop them. Because you could not kill bugs faster than they made new bugs, the math simply did not work. But what if you did not have to kill them at all? What if you could just move them somewhere else, somewhere far away where they could not hurt anyone? And that was what the sphere did. It moved things. Frank frowned and asked how you moved something as big as a Krathi fleet. And Lisa smiled wider because this was the beautiful part. The part that made all the sleepless nights and failed experiments worth it. And she explained that the sphere generated what they were calling a displacement field, a bubble of twisted space that could grab anything inside it and relocate that thing to predetermined coordinates instantly. No travel time, no warning, just here 1 second and 50 light years away the next. And the range could cover an entire star system with proper calibration. The general's eyes went wide as he processed the implications, and Lisa could see his mind racing through tactical applications. And he asked the question that mattered most: how many could they build? Because one prototype was interesting but useless for changing a war that spanned thousands of light years, and Lisa had good news on that front. With current industrial capacity, humanity could build 300 units within 2 years, enough to cover all of Council space and then some, enough to move every Krathi in the galaxy to the middle of nowhere. Peter pulled up a holographic display showing what would happen when they deployed the network. Each sphere would cover a specific region of space, overlapping slightly for redundancy, and when a Krathi fleet entered any protected system, the displacement field would activate automatically, grabbing every bug ship within range and throwing them into deep space between spiral arms, billions of light years from anything, where they would drift until they starved or killed each other or simply died of old age. And the beautiful part was that it required no human crews, no soldiers, no risk, just technology doing what technology did best. Frank asked if they had tested it, and Lisa admitted they had not because testing required having Krathi to test on, and humanity had sealed its borders. But the simulations were perfect, the math checked out, the quantum mechanics were solid, and she was as certain as any scientist could be that it would work when deployed. Though she understood if the military wanted more assurance before committing to full production, and Frank surprised her by laughing, a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the observation deck. The general explained that he had been in the military long enough to know that sometimes you had to take risks. That perfect certainty was a luxury you could not afford in war, and if Dr. Grant said the science was solid, then he believed her. Besides which, humanity had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and the Council was dying out there. The Taloran were down to scattered refugee fleets. The Zenther had lost their homeworld, and the Vexari were making their last stand. So it was now or never. Time to see if humanity's crazy plan would actually work. Lisa felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, because if she was wrong, if the displacement fields failed or had unintended side effects, then humanity would have wasted 5 years and countless resources on nothing, and the Council would die cursing the human name. But if she was right, if this worked the way she believed it would, then they were about to end a 200-year war without firing a single shot, and that was worth the risk. Meanwhile, in Council space, things had gone from bad to worse. Ambassador Vexitar sat in the command center of his people's capital world and watched the sensor displays showing the approaching Krathi fleet. 10,000 ships, maybe more, enough to wipe out everything the Vexari had left. And he knew this was the end. His people had fought for 2 centuries, but now there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and all he could do was prepare to die with honor. He thought about humanity sometimes, about the cowards who had abandoned the Council in their darkest hour, and he felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, but it was tired anger now, worn down by years of loss and defeat, and part of him wondered if maybe the humans had been right to leave. Maybe survival was more important than honor. But it was too late for such thoughts now. The Krathi were coming, and the Vexari would make their last stand. Vextar sent one final message to Earth, knowing it would not be answered because humanity had ignored every communication for 5 years. But he sent it anyway because he wanted someone to know that the Vexari had fought to the end. And his message was not a request for military aid because he knew that would never come. It was a plea for asylum, asking if humanity would at least save some of his people, let them live on in human space even if the Vexari civilization died. And he did not expect a response, but he sent it anyway because what else could he do? President Kevin Walsh sat in his office on Earth and watched Vextar's message alone. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than grim determination. He felt hope because the timing was perfect. The displacement network was ready, the fleets were prepared, and humanity was about to do what they had withdrawn to do. They were about to change the rules of warfare forever. And he picked up his phone and called Admiral Helen Brooks with 2 simple words that would echo through history. "Show them," he said. And Helen smiled because she had been waiting 5 years to hear those words. 5 years of building and planning and preparing while the galaxy cursed humanity's name, and now it was time to prove that walking away had not been cowardice but wisdom, that humanity had not abandoned the fight but changed it. And she gave the orders that would deploy 300 displacement spheres across Council space. Orders that would bring human ships back into the war. Orders that would end the Krathi threat forever. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn and felt his hands shake as he read his orders. Deployment to Vexari space, immediate departure, full fleet escort, and after 5 years of shame and guilt and wondering if they had made the right choice, he was finally going back, finally going to face the people they had abandoned, and he had no idea what he would say to them. But it did not matter because words would not fix what humanity had broken. Only actions would do that, and if Dr. Grant's miracle weapon worked, then maybe, just maybe, they could earn forgiveness. The Krathi swarm descended on the Vexari homeworld like a biblical plague, and Vextar watched them come, with the calm that only comes when you have accepted death. 10,000 ships blotting out the stars, each one carrying millions of the insectoid horrors that had haunted his nightmares for decades, and behind him the pathetic remnants of the Council fleet prepared for one final battle. 300 ships against 10,000, mathematics that even a child could understand. And he felt tired. So very tired of fighting and losing and watching his people die. The Krathi were close enough now that he could see their individual ships on the tactical display, organic vessels that pulsed with unnatural life, and Vextar was about to give the order to advance, to sell their lives as dearly as possible, when space itself seemed to tear open and ships began pouring through, human ships, hundreds of them, and for a moment he could not process what he was seeing, because it made no sense. Humanity had abandoned them 5 years ago. Humanity had sealed their borders and ignored every plea for help. So why were they here now when it was too late to matter? The human vessels were strange, not warships but spherical constructs that moved with purpose into a grid pattern around the entire system. And Vexitar felt confusion replace his acceptance of death because what were they doing? Why were they not attacking? Why were they just sitting there while the Krathi advanced? And then Admiral Helen Brooks's voice came over every communication channel in a dozen languages. Calm and professional and absolutely certain, telling all Council ships to pull back to minimum safe distance because what they were about to see might be disorienting. Vexitar wanted to demand answers, but his training took over, and he ordered his fleet to comply, pulling back from their defensive positions while the strange human spheres continued their mysterious deployment, and the Crothy swarm kept coming because why would they stop? They had never stopped before. They had never needed to stop. And Vexitar watched the gap between the Council fleet and the swarm close with every passing second. Watched the humans do nothing. And he felt anger building in his chest because if this was some kind of joke, if humanity had come back just to watch them die, he would curse their name with his last breath. Then the spheres activated and reality itself seemed to bend. Space twisted in ways that made Vexitar's eyes hurt to watch. And the Crathy swarm simply vanished. All 10,000 ships, millions upon millions of drones, there one moment and gone the next, not destroyed, not scattered, just gone as if they had never existed. And Vexitar's mind struggled to comprehend what he had just witnessed, because matter did not just disappear, physics did not work that way, but the sensor displays confirmed what his eyes had seen. The Crothy were gone. His communications officer was shouting something, but Vexitar could not hear over the roaring in his ears. And he forced himself to focus, to process what had happened, and he opened a channel to the human fleet with hands that shook like leaves, demanding to know what they had done. And Jake Morrison's face appeared on his screen, older than Vexitar remembered, lines around his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. But his voice was steady as he explained in simple terms that would haunt Vexitar for the rest of his life. We moved them, Jake said, approximately 50 light-years in a random direction into deep space. No planets, no resources, no way home, and they will drift there until they starve or die of old age, but they will never threaten anyone again. And Vexitar felt his world tilt because humans could just move things. Move entire fleets, move millions of tons of organic matter across impossible distances, and he asked the question that was burning in his mind, asking if they could move anything. And Jake's smile was small and sad as he answered. Watch, Jake said. And the human fleet sensors lit up, showing another Crothy fleet approaching from the galactic north. Drawn by the pheromone signals of the first wave, thousands more ships coming to join the feast, and the displacement spheres rotated in their grid pattern. Space bent again, and that fleet vanished too, gone in an instant, and Vexitar watched it happen again. And again, each time a new Crathy force appeared, it was simply removed from existence, relocated to the endless void between spiral arms where nothing lived and nothing ever would. The battle that Vexitar had prepared to die in lasted 6 hours, but there was no battle. Not really, just the systematic removal of every Crothy vessel that entered Vexari space. And by the end of it, the swarm had learned that something was wrong, that their ships were disappearing, but they kept coming anyway because that was what the swarm did. They kept coming until there was nothing left, except this time it was the Crothy who had nothing left, and Vexitar watched as the tide of war reversed in a single day. Admiral Helen Brooks appeared on every council channel looking exactly as Vexitar remembered her, older but unbroken, and her words were simple, explaining that human ships were deploying displacement spheres across all of Council space, that within 24 hours every major system would be protected, that the Crathy swarm would be systematically removed from the galaxy, and the war that had lasted 2 centuries would be over. And Vexitar listened to her speak and felt tears running down his face because he had thought they would die today, had made peace with it, but instead they would live. The deployment proceeded exactly as Helen had promised. Human ships appeared in system after system carrying their miraculous spheres, and everywhere they went the Crathy vanished. Entire fleets relocated to the empty darkness between galaxies, and the Council species who had spent 5 years cursing humanity's name now watched in stunned silence as humans did what 2 centuries of conventional warfare had failed to do. They ended the threat without firing a shot, without losing a single life, just cold mechanical efficiency removing the problem from existence. Jake Morrison found himself working 18-hour shifts coordinating the deployment, jumping from system to system, watching the displacement fields activate over and over, and each time he felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that it worked, that Dr. Grant's impossible science had actually functioned as promised, but sorrow for all the time wasted, all the lives lost, all the suffering that could have been avoided if they had thought of this solution earlier. and he knew that guilt would stay with him forever. The Zenthir sent a message thanking humanity for saving their remaining colonies. The Tileran refugee fleets gathered in human-protected space and wept with joy. And smaller council species who had been on the verge of extinction suddenly found themselves safe for the first time in living memory. And the messages kept coming. Gratitude mixed with confusion. Relief mixed with shame, because they all remembered the songs they had sung about human cowardice, the stories they had told their children about the betrayal, and now those stories looked very different. Vexitar asked for a private channel with Jake, and when it opened, he did not know what to say. How do you apologize for 5 years of hatred? How do you take back every curse and insult? And Jake seemed to understand because he spoke first, his voice gentle as he explained that no apology was needed, that humanity had known what walking away would cost, had accepted the hatred as the price of finding a better solution, and Vexitar felt shame burning in his chest because humans had endured 5 years of being called cowards, while they worked to save everyone, and his people had cursed them for it. The last Krathi fleet was displaced from Council space 72 hours after the deployment began, 72 hours to end a war that had lasted 200 years. And across the galaxy, people emerged from shelters they had lived in for generations, returned to planets they had abandoned, began rebuilding cities that had been destroyed, and everywhere they looked, they saw the strange human spheres hanging in space like guardian angels, silent watchers that made sure the Krathi could never return. And slowly, very slowly, the galaxy began to heal. 1 year had passed since the day the Krathi swarm vanished from Council space, and Jake Morrison stood in the rebuilt Council chambers on the Vexari homeworld, older now with more gray in his hair than he liked to admit, but his eyes were clear and his voice steady as he prepared to speak to an audience that had once sung songs about his cowardice. And the irony was not lost on him that he had been asked to explain why humanity had done what everyone had called betrayal, but now called salvation. The chamber was filled with representatives from every council species. Some faces he recognized from before the withdrawal. Most were new because so many of the old guard had died in the war, and they all watched him with a mixture of gratitude and shame, wanting to understand how humanity had known to walk away, how they had found the answer that everyone else had missed. And Jake took a deep breath before beginning because this was important. Getting this right mattered more than any battle he had ever fought. "We did not abandon you," he said, and let those words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, explaining that humanity had left because they needed time to think differently, that for 200 years the Council had fought the Krathi the only way they knew how. Direct combat, ship to ship, body count for body count. And they had been losing because that was the Krathi's game and the bugs were better at it, had evolved for it, thrived on it, and no amount of courage or honor or sacrifice would change that fundamental reality. Jake gestured to the holographic display showing the displacement field network, now permanent installations throughout Council space, maintained jointly by human and Council engineers, and he explained that humanity had learned something in their own bloody history, that sometimes the only way to win a war is to refuse to fight it the way your enemy expects, that you cannot outbreed an enemy that breeds faster, cannot outfight an enemy that fights better, so you change the rules, you make it so fighting is not necessary. You remove the enemy from the board entirely. Ambassador Vexitar spoke up from his seat, restored to his position but humbled by everything that had happened, and he asked the question Jake had been expecting, pointing out that humanity had made the Council think they were cowards, that they had abandoned honor and duty, and Jake nodded because it was true, they had done exactly that, and he would do it again without hesitation, because honor means nothing if your species is extinct, pride means nothing if your children have no future, and humanity had walked away so they could find another path, a path that led to survival instead of glorious death. The words seemed harsh, but Jake did not soften them because the Council needed to hear the truth, needed to understand that their 200-year war had been built on faulty assumptions, that they had valued honor over effectiveness, tradition over innovation, and it had nearly killed them all, and humanity had refused to die for those values, had chosen survival over glory, and that choice had saved everyone, but it had required the courage to endure 5 years of hatred and shame, and Jake wanted them to understand that walking away had not been the easy choice. It had been the hardest thing humanity had ever done. President Kevin Walsh appeared via hologram, older now but still sharp, and he added his own perspective, explaining that the Galactic Council had failed because it was built on the assumption that war had to be fought a certain way, that there were rules and protocols and traditions that could not be broken, but humanity came from a world where survival had always required breaking rules, questioning assumptions, trying new approaches even when everyone said they were impossible, and that cultural difference had made all the difference when applied to a seemingly unsolvable problem. Kevin proposed something that had been discussed in back channels for months: the formation of a new council built on different principles, where innovation mattered more than tradition, where creativity was valued over conformity, where the best idea won regardless of which species proposed it, and where survival was always more important than pride. And the room was silent as representatives processed what he was suggesting, because this was not a small change. This was a complete reimagining of how galactic civilization worked. The vote took 3 hours of debate, but the outcome was never really in doubt because everyone in that room had seen what traditional thinking had cost them, had watched their worlds burn because they refused to change. And when the final tally was counted, the new council was formed with humanity as a founding member, not because humans were stronger or smarter or better, but because they had proven willing to do what no one else would, to walk away from a fight they could not win, and come back with a solution that worked. Dr. Lisa Grant watched the proceedings from Earth via live feed and felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride. She had spent 5 years working 18-hour days, chasing impossible mathematics, questioning every assumption about how physics worked, and the result had saved trillions of lives. But she was not interested in glory or recognition. She was interested in what came next, because the displacement technology had applications far beyond warfare, and she was already working on ways to use it for peaceful purposes, for instant transportation, for moving resources, for solving problems that had seemed impossible before. Peter Hughes sat beside her in the laboratory and asked if she thought the galaxy would remember what humanity had done, if history would record them as heroes or cowards or something in between. And Lisa smiled because she did not care what history said. She cared that her children would grow up in a galaxy without the Krathi, that researchers like her could focus on discovery instead of survival, that maybe, just maybe, the new council would create something better than what had come before. The displacement field technology was gifted to all council species with full technical specifications and no restrictions, a gesture that shocked many, because humanity could have kept it secret, could have used it as leverage, could have demanded payment or concessions, but they gave it freely because that was the point, that technology should be shared, that innovation should benefit everyone, and within 10 years the galaxy would be covered by a network that made large-scale warfare effectively obsolete, and that was worth more than any amount of political capital. Jake Morrison retired from active service 6 months after the new council was formed. His duty done, his conscience clear, and he bought a small house on the coast of New Ireland Colony where he could watch the ocean and think about everything that had happened. And he spent his days writing a memoir that he knew most people would never read, but that he needed to write anyway, because someone should record what it felt like to make the hardest choice, to endure the hatred, to walk away from people who needed you because staying would kill everyone. The title came easily because there was only one moment that mattered, only one decision that had changed everything, and he called it The Day We Stopped Fighting, because that was the truth in its simplest form. Humanity had not won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance or even the miracle technology that Dr. Grant had developed. They had won by refusing to play a game they could not win, by taking time to change the rules, by proving that survival did not require sacrifice of everything that made life worth living. Vextar came to visit him once, making the long journey from the homeworld to New Ireland, and they sat on Jake's porch watching the sunset, while the old ambassador struggled to find words for what he wanted to say. And finally he just said thank you. 2 simple words that carried the weight of 5 years of shame and 5 centuries of potential future, and Jake nodded because no other words were needed. They both understood what had been saved and what it had cost. The galaxy learned its lesson in the hardest way possible, learned that sometimes courage means walking away, that sometimes wisdom looks like cowardice until hindsight makes it clear that humanity had taught them all something fundamental about survival, by doing the one thing no one expected, walking away from a war everyone said they had to fight, and coming back with hope instead of more death. And that lesson would echo through galactic history for millennia to come. Jake watched the sun set over the alien ocean and felt peace for the first time in 20 years. Peace knowing that he had made the right choice even when it felt wrong, that Admiral Brooks had been right to withdraw, that President Walsh had been right to seal the borders, that Dr. Grant had been right to chase impossible science, and most importantly, that humanity had been right to value life over glory, tomorrow over today, hope over despair, and in the end that had made all the difference, because the war had changed forever the day humans walked away.